Have you ever dealt with a nightmare homeowners association? That one person, drunk on a thimbleful of power, who genuinely believes they own the whole neighborhood, dictating everything from the precise shade of beige your mailbox can be to the acceptable decibel level of a child's laughter? Well, I had one who decided I was the blight on her pristine suburban paradise and tried to evict me. Little did she know, she picked a fight with entirely the wrong retiree. My name is Mark, or at least that's the name I go by these days. For 30 years, my life was a tapestry woven with threads of observation, analysis, and discretion, all in service to the Central Intelligence Agency. She thought I was just some quiet old widower, tending his roses, easy to push around. She was about to discover just how profoundly mistaken she was. So, stick around because this is the story of how my intended peaceful retirement morphed into one last, albeit very localized, intelligence operation, and how a certain HOA Karen learned that surveillance, much like a well-tended garden, can flourish in the most unexpected places. Where are you folks watching from today? Settle in, and let me know in the comments down below if you've ever had a memorable run-in with someone who let a little bit of authority go straight to their head. The move to Maple Creek was supposed to be a gentle closing chapter. After Eleanor passed, the silence in our old house, the one filled with echoes of her laughter and the scent of her lemon scones, became a leaden weight. I needed a change, a place where memories wouldn't ambush me at every turn. Maple Creek, with its tree-lined streets and promises of tranquil anonymity, seemed perfect. I bought a modest two-bedroom bungalow. Its biggest selling point, a small, sun-drenched patch of earth out back, perfect for the roses Eleanor had loved. My intentions were simple. Read the books I'd never had time for, cultivate those roses, and perhaps, eventually, find a quiet rhythm to my days. The skills honed over 3 decades, the patient observation, the meticulous data collection, the ability to disappear into the background. I believed them to be retired, packed away like old service medals. I sought nothing more than to be an unremarkable, elderly gentleman minding his own business. It took less than a week for Brenda McAllister, president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association, to make her presence known. She didn't so much introduce herself as materialize on my doorstep. A clipboard clutched like a scepter, her eyes, the color of faded denim, cataloging every perceived infraction on my still unpacked property. She was a woman of a certain age, with a helmet of unervingly immobile blonde hair and a voice that could curdle milk at 20 paces. "Mr. Thompson, is it?" she'd announced, not waiting for confirmation. "I am Brenda McAllister, HOA president. Your lawn is a 1/4 inch over regulation height. And that bird feeder, squirrels, you know. Article 7, subsection B, prohibits attractants for vermin." Vermin? I thought, glancing at the cheerful chickadees already discovering the sunflower seeds. She considers squirrels on par with bubonic plague carriers. Outwardly, I maintained the placid, slightly bewildered demeanor I'd cultivated for such encounters. "Oh, my apologies, Mistress McAllister. Still getting settled. I'll see to it." Her reign, I soon learned, was absolute, or so she believed. She patrolled Maple Creek in her golf cart, the compliance cruiser, as I'd heard a wry neighbor mutter, a tiny Napoleon surveying her domain. The HOA newsletters were less about community and more like papal decrees, filled with new, increasingly Byzantine regulations. No garden gnomes of unsanctioned height. Holiday decorations to be erected and dismantled within a precise 48-hour window. Trash cans to be invisible from the street except on collection day, between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6:05 a.m., or so it felt. I'd seen her measure the distance between fence posts with a laser leveler and once witnessed her berate a teenager for the aggressive hue of a skateboard. For months, I'd been a passive observer of this low-grade tyranny, cataloging her patterns, her enforcers on the board, the simmering resentment amongst some residents. It was data, filed away without specific purpose, a habit too ingrained to break. I complied with her petty edicts, kept my head down, and focused on my roses. My preliminary, almost subconscious surveillance, had painted a picture of a woman deeply insecure, her identity and self-worth inextricably linked to the power she wielded over this small patch of suburbia. The inciting incident, the spark that ignited the dormant fires of my past profession, was, in retrospect, laughably trivial. I'd painted my front door. Eleanor had always loved a cheerful blue, a specific shade called Forget-Me-Not. I found a can, a perfect match to a swatch she'd saved, and spent a quiet Saturday giving the door a fresh coat. It was a small act of remembrance, a splash of color in my muted world. 2 days later, an official notice was taped to my newly blue door. Violation, unapproved exterior modification, door color, non-compliant with approved palette, Schedule C, page 12, swatch group Gamma 7. It was accompanied by a grainy photo of my door, circled in angry red. The fine was $50, with an additional $10 per day until rectified. I sighed. Annoying, yes, but manageable. I planned to simply repaint it to some HOA-approved shade of beige. But Brenda McAllister, it seemed, wasn't content with mere compliance. Perhaps she sensed my passive resistance, my quiet lack of deference. Perhaps my blue door was simply the excuse she needed. A week after the door incident, while I was carefully pruning a particularly stubborn Jackson and Perkins climber, a certified letter arrived. My heart, a veteran of far more dangerous missives, still gave an uncomfortable lurch. It was an eviction notice. The grounds were a ludicrous tapestry of outright fabrications and wild exaggerations. Multiple sustained and willful violations, it declared, citing the blue door, still uncorrected as I was waiting for a weekend to repaint the vermin-attracting bird feeder, which I'd admittedly kept, moving it to the backyard, and a new, astonishing claim, conduct detrimental to the peace and quiet of the community, including late-night disturbances and suspicious activities. Late-night disturbances? Suspicious activities? I was in bed by 9:30 most nights, usually with a history book. My most suspicious activity was probably trying to figure out the optimal pH for rose soil. This wasn't just petty tyranny anymore. This was a direct, malicious assault. She wasn't just trying to find me. She was trying to uproot me, to take away the fragile peace I was trying to build. A cold, familiar calm settled over me. The grief for Eleanor, the weariness of decades in the shadows, receded, replaced by clarity I hadn't felt in years. Brenda McAllister had made a critical error. She had mistaken a dormant volcano for an extinct one. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My initial response was a quiet fury, a sense of profound injustice. This woman, I thought, is attempting to destroy my sanctuary based on lies. Then the analyst kicked in. She feels threatened by something. What is it? My noncompliance? My perceived difference? Or is there something more she's trying to protect by eliminating any potential scrutiny? That evening, instead of reading about the Peloponnesian War, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a fresh pen. The faint scent of Eleanor's potpourri, a lavender and rose blend she always kept in a crystal bowl, seemed to clear my head. The decision wasn't even a conscious one. It was an activation. I would not be evicted. I would not be hounded from my home. And Brenda McAllister would learn a valuable lesson about underestimating the quiet man with the blue door. My training, the sum of my career, wasn't in direct confrontation, but in the patient, meticulous dismantling of threats through information and strategy. Surveillance, data analysis, psychological profiling, understanding bureaucratic weaknesses, exploiting an opponent's overconfidence. These were the tools of my trade. They were rusty, perhaps, but fundamentally sound. She thinks this is about HOA bylaws. I'm used. It's about to become an exercise in applied intelligence. The first step was information. I already had a baseline from my passive observations. Brenda's routines, her golf cart patrols, her known associates on the HOA board, a nervous, bespectacled treasurer named Arthur Jenkins, and a stern-faced woman, Dolores Crandall, who seemed to function as Brenda's enforcer. But this suspicious activity claim was new. It was a fabrication designed to escalate the situation beyond mere aesthetic violations. It hinted at desperation, or a profound misjudgment on her part. I started with the HOA's own documents, which, as a homeowner, I was entitled to request. I spent hours poring over the CC and RS, covenants, conditions and restrictions, the bylaws, and, most importantly, the minutes of past HOA meetings and their financial statements for the last 3 years. The language was dense, often deliberately obfuscatory, but I'd waded through far murkier bureaucratic swamps. Patterns began to emerge. Vague line items in the budget. Consistently awarded contracts for landscaping and minor repairs to a single company. Prestige Property Solutions, a name I didn't recognize locally. The invoices were always just under the threshold that required multiple bids. Interesting. My quiet suburban street, I realized, had been under my informal, almost subconscious surveillance since I arrived. Brenda's comings and goings, the hushed, anxious conversations of neighbors when she passed, the subtle ways people avoided her. It had all been logged. Now that surveillance became active and focused. I reactivated some old, personal gear, a pair of high-powered, image-stabilizing binoculars, a discreet digital audio recorder with excellent range. My house, situated on a slight rise, offered a surprisingly good vantage point for observing the comings and goings on Brenda Street, 2 blocks over. My late-night, suspicious activities became very real, though not in the way Brenda imagined. I took to quiet, pre-dawn walks, noting the vehicles parked outside certain houses, the patterns of lights. I observed Brenda's interactions, not just with residents, but with service providers. One morning, I saw a Prestige Property Solutions truck parked in her driveway for over an hour. No visible work was being done. The driver, a burly man with a tattoo of a snarling wolf on his forearm, eventually emerged with Brenda, both of them laughing. He handed her a plain, white envelope. She slipped it into her purse with a satisfied smile. Curiouser and curiouser. My next step was to identify potential allies. I wasn't going to fight this alone. In my profession, reliable local assets were invaluable. I started with Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Brenda had forced her to remove a decades-old rose trellis because it was structurally unsound, a claim Mrs. Gable tearfully refuted. I found her tending her now-bare wall, her shoulders slumped. Mrs. Gable, I began gently. I received an eviction notice. Her eyes widened. Oh, dear Mark, not you too. That woman, she's a terror. She cited suspicious activities, I said, watching her reaction. Suspicious? Mrs. Gable scoffed. The only thing suspicious around here is how the HOA fees keep going up and the services keep getting worse. And that Brenda always got new landscaping, a new patio set on her volunteer HOA president stipend. Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Jackpot. Mrs. Gable had lived in Maple Creek for 40 years. She was a walking archive of neighborhood history and grievances. Over tea and surprisingly good ginger snaps, Mrs. Gable became my first unofficial consultant. She recounted years of Brenda's petty tyrannies, her vindictiveness, her way of turning neighbors against each other. She thrives on control, dear, Mrs. Gable said, her gaze sharp. And she hates anyone who doesn't bow and scrape. Your blue door, that was just an excuse. You're new, you're quiet, you don't fawn over her. That makes you a threat in her little kingdom. She also gave me a name, David Lee. He and his wife, Sarah, a young couple who lived on the next street, have been fined repeatedly for their children's toys being left in their own driveway for more than the allotted 60 minutes, according to Mrs. Gable. David was a tech-savvy accountant and had once tried to question the HOA financials at a meeting, only to be shut down by Brenda and her cronies. I found David Lee washing his car, 2 young children helping with more soap than water. He was wary at first. My reputation, thanks to Brenda, was likely already tarnished. Mr. Thompson, he asked, his brow furrowed. Call me Mark. I understand you've had some experiences with our HOA president. A wry smile touched his lips. You could say that. Heard she's trying to run you out of town over a paint job. Among other things, I replied. She's accusing me of late-night disturbances and suspicious activities. I was wondering if you'd ever try to get a clear look at the HOA's detailed expenditures. David's eyes lit up with a spark of frustrated recognition. Tried. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Vague summaries, no proper invoices available for review. I suspect something's rotten, but proving it. Perhaps, I said, we could pool our resources and talents. I have some experience in information gathering and analysis. Over the next week, our small band of dissidents grew. The Lees, fueled by their own frustrations and David's sharp financial mind, were eager recruits. Mrs. Gable provided historical context and a network of equally disgruntled, though more timid, long-term residents. Another couple, the Potters, who had been forced to remove a perfectly healthy, beautiful oak tree because Brenda claimed its roots might one day interfere with a mythical underground sprinkler system upgrade, joined our cause. They had photos, angry letters, a history of bullying. My investigation into Prestige Property Solutions deepened. A quick search of business licenses revealed it was a relatively new company, incorporated just 2 years ago, shortly after Brenda became HOA president. The registered agent? One Gerald Kowalski. A little more digging, public records, social media, the kind of open-source intelligence that was child's play after years of tracking far more elusive targets, revealed Gerald Kowalski was Brenda McAllister's brother-in-law. The plain white envelope began to make a lot more sense. Kickbacks, inflated contracts, embezzlement, plain and simple, dressed up in HOA bureaucracy. The digital trail was harder to crack, but not impossible. David Lee, with his accounting background, knew what to look for. We drafted a formal, legally precise request, citing specific HOA bylaws that guaranteed homeowners access to financial records, demanding detailed invoices for all payments made to Prestige Property Solutions. We also requested access to unredacted board meeting minutes, not just the sanitized summaries Brenda published. Brenda naturally stalled. The records are in storage, she'd replied coolly to David's email. Access requires board approval and will take several weeks to arrange. Too slow, I thought. She's trying to run out the clock on my eviction. Meanwhile, Brenda escalated her campaign against me. She'd take to loudly commiserating with Dolores Crandall within my earshot as I worked in my garden. Some people just don't respect community standards, Dolores. Bringing down property values with their eccentricities, she'd make a point of driving her compliance cruiser slowly past my house multiple times a day, often stopping to peer intently at my windows or yard, scribbling notes on her ever-present clipboard. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to make me feel constantly watched, pressured. She had no idea how accustomed I was to being watched, or how adept I was at reversing the gaze. Her arrogance was making her predictable, and therefore vulnerable. Each of her petty actions was another data point, another brushstroke in the portrait of her corruption I was painting. She also tried to turn other neighbors against me. We heard whispers of her telling people I was unstable, a recluse with a temper, implying my suspicious activities were genuinely sinister. But her credibility, already thin with many, was wearing even thinner as our quiet inquiries began to circulate. People were starting to talk, to compare notes. My blue door had, ironically, become a quiet symbol of resistance. She's getting nervous, David observed one evening as we reviewed a new batch of heavily redacted financial summaries Brenda had grudgingly provided after our second formal request threatened legal action. These redactions are ridiculous. What is she hiding under these black bars? Our job, I said, my voice calm, is to find out, and then to show everyone. We needed a more direct approach for the financials. Mrs. Gable remembered that Arthur Jenkins, the timid HOA treasurer, had once expressed private misgivings about Brenda's spending before being cowed into submission. Arthur was our weak link. He was a man drowning in paperwork he likely didn't fully understand, terrified of Brenda, but perhaps, just perhaps, possessing a shred of conscience. I decided to approach Arthur directly, but carefully, not with threats, but with an appeal to his own precarious position. I found him one afternoon at the local library, a place he frequented to escape, I suspected, the pressures of his HOA duties, and perhaps his own home life. "Mr. Jenkins," I said softly, sitting down opposite him at a secluded table. He jumped, his eyes wide and fearful. "Mr. Thompson, I can't talk about the eviction. Brenda's orders." "I'm not here about my eviction, Arthur," I said, using his first name to try and build a sliver of rapport. "I'm here about you, about your legal responsibilities as treasurer, about what happens when misappropriation of funds comes to light, and who gets caught in the crossfire." I paused, letting the implications sink in. Prestige Property Solutions. Gerald Kowalski. Inflated invoices. Kickbacks. These are serious words, Arthur. And the paper trail always leads back to the person signing the checks and the person who is supposed to be overseeing the accounts. Arthur paled. His hands trembled as he fiddled with his glasses. I just do what Brenda tells me. She says it's all above board. She handles the contracts. But you approve the payments, don't you, Arthur? You sign off on the financials. When this all comes out, and it will come out, Brenda will throw you under the bus so fast your head will spin. She'll claim you were negligent, or worse, complicit. Are you prepared for that? He stared at me, his face a mask of dawning horror. He's not a bad man, I thought, just a weak one. And fear is a powerful motivator. What do you want? He whispered, his voice barely audible. I want the truth, Arthur. I want the unredacted financials. The real invoices from Prestige. The correspondence about these contracts. Not for retribution, but for transparency. To protect the homeowners. And frankly, to protect you from taking the fall for Brenda's greed, I pushed a plain USB drive across the table. Copies, Arthur. For your own protection as much as ours. Think about it. I left him there, a man visibly wrestling with his conscience and his fear. It was a calculated risk. He could run straight to Brenda, or he could choose self-preservation. My read on him suggested the latter was more likely. He was a man terrified of confrontation, and the prospect of legal jeopardy was a confrontation of the highest order. While we waited to see if Arthur would crack, the stakes continued to rise. Brenda, perhaps sensing the net tightening, or simply enraged by my continued defiance, I hadn't repainted the blue door, a small, daily act of rebellion, tried to accelerate my eviction. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, agenda item, Thompson property, resolution for immediate removal. Dolores Crandall and another of Brenda's loyalists on the 5-member board would surely vote with her. Arthur was the swing vote. The 5th member, a quiet woman named Maria Sanchez, had always seemed intimidated by Brenda, but fair-minded. "This is it," David said, his face grim, when Mrs. Gable relayed the news of the emergency meeting scheduled for the following evening. "If she gets that vote, it'll be much harder to fight. Then we need to ensure she doesn't get that vote," I replied. "It's time to deploy our own assets." Our plan had been to gather overwhelming evidence and present it at the annual HOA meeting, still 2 months away. Brenda's aggression had forced our hand. We had to move faster. That afternoon, the USB drive appeared in my mailbox, tucked inside a plain envelope. No note, just a drive. Arthur had made his choice. David and I spent the entire night going through the files. It was worse than we'd imagined. Unredacted invoices from Prestige Property Solutions were, on average, 30 to 50% higher than legitimate quotes we'd discreetly obtained from other local contractors for similar work. Emails between Brenda and Gerald Kowalski discussed commission percentages and discretionary fund allocations, with thinly veiled references to their kickback scheme. There were records of HOA funds being used for personal expenses for Brenda. A new set of expensive patio furniture listed as community area beautification, a consulting fee paid to a spa she frequented. It was a systematic siphoning of community money, all orchestrated by Brenda, facilitated by her brother-in-law, and rubber-stamped by a terrified or complicit board. "She's been robbing us blind for years," David breathed, his face a mixture of anger and vindication. This is criminal." "Indeed," I said, a cold satisfaction settling in. "And tomorrow night, at her emergency meeting to evict me, we're going to present our findings." Not just to the board, but to any homeowner who wishes to attend. We needed to turn her weapon, the HOA meeting, against her. The plan was simple, direct, and relied on Brenda's own arrogance. She expected a hearing about my alleged violations. She would be entirely unprepared for a public audit of her conduct. We spent the morning making copies of the most damning documents, preparing a concise presentation. Mrs. Gable, bless her, activated her phone tree, quietly inviting every resident she knew who had a grievance against Brenda to attend the important HOA board meeting concerning community integrity. The Potters volunteered to set up a discreet camera to record the proceedings. For posterity, Mr. Potter had said with a grim smile. Brenda's continued maneuvers were almost comical in their predictability. She sent Dolores Crandall on a pre-meeting reconnaissance mission, driving slowly past my house, then David's, then Mrs. Gable's, undoubtedly reporting back on any signs of organized resistance. She probably thought we were huddling, panicking. In reality, we were calmly assembling an evidence package that would detonate her little empire. The personal risks felt manageable. My identity was secure. My past life was a closed book. The worst she could do was make my retirement uncomfortable, and she was already doing a fine job of that. The true risk was to the community if we failed. The community room attached to the small HOA office was usually sparsely attended for board meetings. Tonight it was packed. Mrs. Gable's phone tree had worked wonders. Faces I recognized from my walks, faces I'd only seen in passing. All were there, an air of anxious anticipation hanging in the room. Brenda, flanked by Dolores Crandall and her other board loyalist, looked momentarily surprised by the turnout, but quickly plastered on her imperious presidential smile. Arthur Jenkins sat at the end of the table, looking pale and avoiding everyone's gaze. Maria Sanchez watched the crowd with a thoughtful expression. "Welcome, everyone," Brenda began, her voice overly bright. "We have a rather full house tonight. We have one item of urgent business on the agenda. The property at 12 Willow Lane, occupied by Mr. Mark Thompson." She looked directly at me, a smirk playing on her lips. "Due to multiple, egregious, and ongoing violations of our community covenants and conduct unbecoming a resident of Maple Creek, the board is considering a resolution for immediate eviction." A murmur went through the crowd. I remained impassive, my gaze steady on hers. "Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to say before the board deliberates and votes on this matter?" she asked, her tone dripping with false magnanimity. This was her stage, her moment of triumph. "I do, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. "But it's not about my blue door or my bird feeder or the entirely fabricated late-night disturbances." I rose slowly, holding a thick binder. David Lee rose with me, holding a laptop. Mrs. Gable stood as well, a small, determined figure. "Before the board considers evicting a resident based on spurious charges," I continued, "perhaps the homeowners of Maple Creek would be interested in discussing some truly suspicious activities that have been occurring within this very HOA, specifically concerning the management of our funds and the conduct of our president." Brenda's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed. "This is out of order, Mr. Thompson. We are here to discuss your violations." "Are we?" I asked mildly. "Because I believe the homeowners might find this a far more pressing matter." David opened the laptop, connecting it to a projector we'd brought. Mr. Potter had persuaded the community center janitor to leave it set up from a prior event. An image flashed onto the wall behind the board table. The first damning invoice from Prestige Property Solutions, side by side with a legitimate quote for the same service at half the price. Gasps rippled through the room. "This is slander. These documents are fabricated." Brenda sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. Dolores Crandall started to rise, looking flustered. "Are they, Brenda?" David Lee's voice cut through her protests, sharp and precise. "Because we have dozens more, all sourced directly from the HOA's own financial records, which Mr. Jenkins kindly provided." He nodded towards Arthur, who sank lower in his chair, looking like he wished the floor would swallow him. The USB drive, evidence of his cooperation, was already safely in my possession. For the next 20 minutes, we laid it all out. The inflated contracts with her brother-in-law's company, the emails discussing kickbacks, the HOA funds diverted for her personal use. Each slide, each document, was a nail in the coffin of her authority. We presented it calmly, factually, like an intelligence briefing. The homeowners listened in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from surprise to anger to outright disgust. I saw neighbors exchanging shocked glances, whispering to each other. The tide was turning palpably. Brenda tried to interrupt, to shout us down. Lies. This is a conspiracy by disgruntled residents. Security. Someone remove these people. But there was no security, only the stunned faces of her community. Her voice grew shrill, desperate. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling before everyone's eyes. And as for the suspicious activities I've been accused of, I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing every eye. They primarily consisted of observing a certain HOA president meeting secretly with the owner of Prestige Property Solutions and accepting envelopes of cash. We even have photographs on the screen. A clear, zoomed-in shot appeared, taken from my discreet vantage point, of Brenda in her driveway, accepting that white envelope from Gerald Kowalski. The date and timestamp were clearly visible. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a wave of angry murmurs. "Thief!" someone shouted. "Resign!" yelled another. Brenda McAllister looked like she'd been slapped. Her face was ashen. She stared at the image, then at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. Dolores Crandall was silent, aghast. The other Loyalist board member looked utterly bewildered. Maria Sanchez, however, was watching Brenda with a look of cold fury. This was the turning point. Brenda's power, built on intimidation and opacity, shattered under the bright light of irrefutable evidence. She tried one last, desperate gambit. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked, banging her gavel, a novelty one, far too large for her, on the table. "This is illegal. You have no right." "Actually, Madam President," Maria Sanchez said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through Brenda's tirade. "According to Article 4, Section 2 of our bylaws, any homeowner can call for a vote of no confidence in a board member if presented with substantial cause. And I believe we have seen substantial cause tonight." She looked around the room. "I call for a vote of no confidence in President Brenda McAllister." Mrs. Gable seconded the motion immediately. "All those in favor of removing Brenda McAllister from the HOA board, please raise your hands," Maria instructed. A sea of hands went up. Mine, David's, Mrs. Gable's, the Potters, dozens more. Even Arthur Jenkins, after a moment of terrified hesitation, slowly, almost imperceptibly, raised his hand. Only Dolores Crandall and the other Loyalist kept their hands down, looking defeated. "The motion carries," Maria announced, her voice filled with a quiet triumph. "Brenda McAllister, you are hereby removed from the Maple Creek HOA Board of Directors, effective immediately." Brenda just stared, her mouth agape. The color had drained completely from her face. Her reign was over. Publicly, decisively, humiliatingly. The eviction notice against me was now less than worthless. My blue door had weathered the storm. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Brenda McAllister didn't say another word. She simply gathered her purse, her face a rigid mask, and walked out of the community room, the angry, disgusted stares of her former subjects following her every step. Dolores Crandall and the other Loyalist board member resigned on the spot via terse, handwritten notes. Arthur Jenkins, looking relieved and terrified in equal measure, offered his immediate resignation as treasurer, which was accepted. In the space of an hour, the Maple Creek HOA power structure had been decapitated and was now being rebuilt from the ground up by the very people it had once oppressed. Maria Sanchez was unanimously voted in as interim president. David Lee, with his financial acumen, agreed to step in as interim treasurer. Mrs. Gable, with her decades of institutional memory, joined the interim board. My vindication was complete. The threat of eviction had vanished like morning mist. More importantly, a palpable sense of relief and empowerment swept through the room. People were talking animatedly, smiling, shaking our hands. They had found their collective voice. The following weeks were dedicated to cleaning house. David, with my quiet analytical assistance, conducted a thorough audit of the HOA finances. The full extent of Brenda's embezzlement was even greater than we initially suspected. Formal complaints were filed with the local police department and the state agency overseeing HOAs. The Prestige Property Solutions contracts were immediately terminated. Legal proceedings were initiated against Brenda and her brother-in-law to recover the misappropriated funds. Her carefully constructed world of petty tyranny and illicit gain was systematically dismantled. The new HOA board, under Maria's calm and sensible leadership, began implementing sweeping changes. Transparency became the new watchword. Financial statements were posted online for all residents to see. Meetings were open, and resident input was actively encouraged. The ridiculously complex and often contradictory set of rules Brenda had instituted was reviewed, and many were either simplified or abolished entirely. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Children's laughter no longer felt like a violation. Garden gnomes of all heights began to appear. My blue door remained blue. For me, life in Maple Creek took on a new dimension. I had sought peace and anonymity, but I found purpose. I hadn't planned to get involved, but I couldn't stand by and watch injustice fester. The skills I thought I'd retired proved to be surprisingly adaptable to suburban skirmishes. I became an informal advisor to the new board, helping them set up more robust financial controls and transparent reporting mechanisms. I even started a small neighborhood watch, not for suspicious activities in the Brenda McAllister sense, but to genuinely foster a sense of community and security. My roses thrived, and so, in a way, did I. The quiet satisfaction of seeing justice done, of seeing a community heal and empower itself, was a balm to old wounds. Brenda McAllister's downfall was total. Facing criminal charges and civil lawsuits, ostracized by the community she once lorded over, she eventually sold her house. At a significant loss, I heard, and moved away. Her brother-in-law's company, Prestige Property Solutions, declared bankruptcy. They became a cautionary tale, a local legend of arrogance and greed meeting a quiet, methodical reckoning. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Well, for one, never underestimate the quiet ones. The ones who observe more than they speak. They might just be cataloging your every misstep. And power, especially unchecked power, has a remarkable tendency to corrupt, even if that power is merely over the color of a neighbor's door or the placement of their trash cans. But more importantly, it shows that even in the face of what seems like entrenched authority, one person, armed with the truth and a bit of strategic thinking, can indeed make a difference. It's amazing what you can find out when people finally feel safe enough to talk, isn't it? Have you ever been in a situation where one person speaking up empowered others? Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. In the end, Brenda McAllister lost her petty throne, her ill-gotten gains, her reputation, and ultimately, her place in our revitalized community. The Maple Creek HOA was transformed from an instrument of oppression into a genuine reflection of its residents' will, all because a blue door dared to defy the approved palate. As for me, I found a different kind of peace, not just in the solitude of my garden, but in the quiet hum of a neighborhood rediscovering its fairness and its voice. Sometimes, the skills you believe are part of a past life find new relevance in the most unexpected arenas. The moral of this story, if there is one, is that bullies and petty tyrants often sow the seeds of their own destruction through their arrogance. And always read the fine print, especially when someone is trying to use it to unjustly uproot you from your own front porch. Thanks for sticking with me through this rather eventful chapter of my quiet retirement. If you enjoyed this story, do give it a like, and perhaps share it with someone who appreciates a good tale of when the underdog, or in this case, the underestimated retiree, comes out on top. What was your favorite part of Brenda's meticulously orchestrated downfall? I'd love to read your comments below.